Okay, so this is Blender. It's an open source CGI 3D suite environment thing which we use to do all sorts of creative stuff. But today I'm going to teach you how to bounce a ball in Blender. Now, if you haven't already got Blender, the easiest way to get hold of it is go here, www.blender.org, and hit the download button. If we go into the downloads, you'll have options here for Windows versions, Mac versions, and Linux versions. There are also available older versions of Blender that may be more compatible with like an older system, particularly if you're a Mac user. And if you're viewing this in the future, then there will be Blender 2.8, which, by the way, just before we get started, the next version of Blender is going to have some significant changes to it in how we do things and how we approach stuff. So I'll address that in a later episode. But for now, using 2.79 and any earlier version, most of it should be the same. So get your download, unpack it, install it, do what you got to do. And this should be approximately what you're seeing. Okay, so Blender's interface is made up of lots of different panels. We've got our main panel here, which is our 3D viewport. Down here we have the timeline panel. Over here we have our properties panels. Over here the outliner, and up top we've got our info panel. Each of these panels can be expanded and contracted by mousing over the edge where two panels meet. You'll get this double arrow sort of icon from your mouse, and then you can left click to drag left and right and up and down to expand and contract these panels as you desire. The other thing you can do is create more panels. So if you look carefully at each panel, there is a left at the bottom left there is a ridged corner, and at the top right there's a ridged corner. You can left click on these corners and pull out another panel. Again, if you've decided you don't want that panel anymore, provided the panels are aligned properly, you can just left click and drag over, and we'll get this big translucent arrow over the top of it, and that will indicate that when you release the mouse button, that it will collapse or merge those two panels. Again, we can do that here. But what you can't do is like I can't do that here to drag over to over our outliner, because there's no split here. We've got one panel there and we've got two panels here, so we can't just drag it over. What we'd have to actually do is split, line that up, and then drag it over. And then we could, drag this one over as well if we wanted. So that's how you actually manipulate the panels. But what you might find is that, the space is right, but what you're looking at is wrong. So for instance, in this top section, maybe we don't want to be looking at our outliner. And that's what this is. It's basically a list of all the stuff in your scene. And we might want to see a 3D view instead. So that's what these buttons do. You can select any of our editor types or different panel types here. So 3D view is our main sort of window onto the world, and then we've got our timeline down here and our info pane up there. And yeah, this is just how you customize the interface. It's very important to know this, because there's a lot of information in Blender, and you'll want to access it in the most sort of convenient way possible. And this is how you do that. So those are panel types. Why don't we take a look at the viewport? Okay, so we've taken a look at how we customize our interface, so why don't we take a look now at how we move around our viewport. The viewport is how we manipulate all the objects in our scene. It's how we interact with our 3D creations, and it is our window into our scene, so we can actually see what we're doing. It's very important. It's where we spend most of our time in Blender. So if you were to hold down the middle mouse button or mouse wheel and then move the mouse about, then you can see we'll rotate around our scene. If you hold down Shift and the middle mouse button, then we can pan about, And if we hold down Control and the middle mouse button, we can zoom in and out. Additionally, you can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel as well by scrolling it. So that's pretty useful. We can select objects by using the right click on our mouse. When we've got an object selected, you can left click. You can manipulate these arrows with the left click button. So we've got the blue x-axis of our object, the green y-axis, and the red x-axis. You can see these axes represented down here in this little reminder in our corner. And you can also see these lines just along the floor, green and red for X and Y axis, just to sort of give you a visual hint as to which way your scene's oriented and where you're seeing it from. So that's how we right click to select, left click to manipulate. Very, very useful. Additionally, we've got different kinds of widgets for transformation down here. So we've got a translation or location sort of movement widget there, a rotation widget, and a scale widget. Again, allowing you to independently manipulate each axis, whether it's scale, rotation, or location. I'm going to hit Alt-R, Alt-G, and Alt-S. That will reset your object to its default location, rotation, and scale. So Alt-G for location, Alt-R for rotation, Alt-S for scale. So if you do change something and you don't like it, you can always go back. Again, Control-Z, like most software, will undo your last couple of moves or couple of changes. So very useful stuff to know. We've also got this this transform orientation option. At the moment, we're transforming globally, yeah? But if I were to rotate the object and change this to local, then now we can transform locally rather than globally. And what that means is this object has its own axis. So it's like, once, because I'd rotated it, that axis changed. And the z-axis was at this diagonal rather than up and down. The global axis, no matter what you do, will always stay up and down. So it's there's a couple of other options in there for, you know, relative to view, relative to object normals, and so on and so forth. Very important stuff, but maybe not for right now. So yeah, that's how we sort of manipulate stuff in Blender. Again, if I go Alt-R, Alt-G, Alt-S, just to reset those values. The other thing is, when I said G, R, and S, they don't just work with the Alt key. If I hit G, I can actually move the object around just by wiggling the mouse there, or R, I can rotate it, S, scale it. And again, we can do that up here as well. There's about 1 million ways to do everything in Blender. So that's the main section of the viewport. We've also got this this tool shelf over here, and you can hide that by hitting T, or bring it back by hitting T. I'm going to hide it one more time, and then you've got this. If you can't remember the shortcut, you've also got this little button here, this little plus icon, which we can click to bring it back, and we can collapse it by sliding the edge, just like all the other panels in Blender. Again, we've also got options to turn this on and off here. On the opposite side, we have the same sort of thing, but it's this one's called the properties shelf, and this actually holds all our values for our object. So if we move our cube, you'll see that the location values, these numbers representing the X, Y, and Z, are changing as we move it about. Likewise with rotation and scale, these numbers change. But they're not there just to look pretty either, or give us that information. We can transform these values by left clicking and dragging in here, or by entering numbers directly. So yeah, very useful. So that's our properties shelf over here. Additionally, there are so many more pieces of information in this shelf. and it's always relative to what you've got selected. It changes all the time, but it's super, super, super useful. So anytime you're looking for a value or something for, like, say even the object's name, we can change that here. You know, it's a veritable goldmine of information. So yeah, that's that. Also in our viewport, we have different modes. What we're currently doing at the moment is manipulating this object in object mode. So that's the overall transform values of an object are dealt with in object mode. But if we wanted to change something about this object, we can go into edit mode, and we can grab any part of its geometry, and we can manipulate it. So these points are called vertices. We're currently in the vertices select mode, and that allows us to, you know, grab it by the verts and change the shape of our object. If we move to edge select mode, you can see we can just select the lines between the verts and manipulate those. And face select mode allows us to select these faces that fill in the gaps between the edges. So verts, edges, and faces are what make up the majority. I can't say that. Oh God. Verts, edges, and faces make up the majority of our geometry in Blender. Oh, I didn't think I was going to do tongue twisters today. So you can select a face and you can scale it, you can rotate it, you can move it. And all I'm doing here is hitting G, R, and S to do that. You can also hit E to extrude, and it allows us to pull faces out of other faces. So we're creating more geometry from the original geometry. So yeah, extrusion modeling, that's the basis of it. Hit E, move the mouse, left click to confirm, and hit E, move the mouse, left click to confirm, and that's how we start building shapes in Blender. Later on I can show you, actually I'll show you now. There's something called subdivision surface modifier, and that allows us to make more organic shapes. I mean, we can turn on smooth shading, and that's how we make sort of non-blocky. So if you want to do anything that doesn't look like Lego or Minecraft, then this is what you use to do that. But that's something for another lesson, I guess. So yeah, that's our object mode. Additionally, there are viewport shading modes here. This is just how we look at the object. It's not changing anything intrinsic about the object, just how we see it. Currently we're in solid shading. We can change to wireframe shading. If we were to do texture painting, or put some materials on this object, we'd want to look at it with a textural materials view. And then we have rendered, and that shows us what the lights will look like and all the different effects and all the cool stuff we can do to our object. We'll see that in rendered viewport, but that does take up a lot of processing power on the computer, so it will slow you down, so we don't work in that all the time. Something else worth knowing is, by default, we're in something called Blender Render, which is the internal render engine of Blender, and it's a bit outdated, but fortunately Blender does come packaged with something called Cycles Render, and Cycles Render is much better, much more realistic rendering engine, which allows us to do cool stuff like that. So yeah, as you can see, it's a very different sort of effect, but it allows us to far more advanced, far more realistic shading and rendering. So that's our viewport shading types. Yeah, is there anything else which we should really jump into now with the viewport? I'm not sure there is. I suppose in relation to the viewport, there is also the timeline, which is just a representation of all the frames that would make up an animation in our project. So if we've got this object here, and I'm just going to record this motion, you can see by scrubbing, left click, and moving the playhead, that's called scrubbing through the timeline, you can see the playback of an animation. You can control playback with with play, pause, and go back to the start, back to the end. We can control how many frames are in our animation. So that's 1 to 81 frames, 1 to 160 frames. This is the current frame that we're on where the playhead sits, and this allows us to record keyframes as we move and manipulate our objects. So that is, in essence, that's what the timeline is there for, and that's how it sort of affects our viewport. So there we go. So that's the viewport, how we move around it, and a little bit on the timeline. Why don't we jump into trying an animation? Okay, so with a brand new file, new, reload startup file, let us start to create an animation, a bouncing ball. I'm going to hit A to deselect everything, and then I'm going to hit A again to select all. Then I'm going to hit X to delete. Lovely jubbly, a nice, clean, empty scene. With the 3D cursor still in the center, again, if you've moved your 3D cursor, Shift-C to recenter it. Then hit Shift-A to add a mesh, UV sphere. Just because it's good practice, we're going to tick our generate UVs box over here, and then I'm going to want to move to something called a front orthographic camera, because that's the way I prefer to see our UV sphere for animating a bouncing animation. So what does any of those words mean? Well, on your number pad of your keyboard, you have a variety of numbers which in Blender allow us to move between different virtual cameras in space. If we hit 1, it moves us to the front perspective camera. 3 will move us to the right perspective camera. 7 will move us to the top perspective camera, looking down overhead. And 5 toggles between something called perspective and orthographic. Now, what on earth does any of that mean? Perspective is something that if you're looking at an object, and there's another object of the same size, but it's in the distance, it's far away. The further away that object is, the smaller it appears, right? So I'm going to take this sphere, I'm going to hit Shift-D to duplicate. You don't need to copy this bit. I'm going to drag that duplicate of the sphere, so it's exactly the same size, and I'm going to drag it into the distance, where it becomes smaller in our viewport to represent that it is far away. That is what perspective is, the shrinking, apparent shrinking of objects as they move further and further from our vantage point. Now, if I were to hit 5 on the numpad, it now changes us to ortho, from perspective to orthographic. And I'm just going to move the view so we can actually see it. But that sphere that is the same size as this sphere, but is really, really far away, now appears to be, despite its distance, it appears to be exactly the same size as this sphere. So that's what orthographic means. It's compression of perspective. It totally removes any perspective, in fact. So objects that are further away no longer appear smaller. This is really good for aligning objects with one another, creating blueprints and that sort of thing. So anyway, I'm just going to hit X to delete this sphere, and I'm going to hit 1 to go to front, and 5 if you're not on orthographic. So toggle between perspective and orthographic. So front ortho camera. Lovely jubbly. Now, can we finally animate? Well, maybe. If I select the sphere, that's right-clicking to select, and I come over here and open up our properties panel, I'm going to add something called a keyframe. A keyframe essentially is, and actually before we do that, we're going to get ourselves another panel to look at, because the timeline's all well and good, but when you're dealing with keyframes, it is much easier to see what you're doing in an editor type called the dope sheet. I'm going to select this corner, just going to split the panel, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to turn this second timeline to a dope sheet. So, keyframes. What on earth are they? A keyframe is saying to Blender, it is saying, at this point in time, we want this object to be here, or to do this. So, for instance, I want, on frame 1, I want this ball to appear. Ooh, what did I do there? Control Z to undo. I want this ball to appear to be in the air, and it's going to fall down and bounce. So, on the first frame, I want it to be here. So I've dragged it up into the air with the left mouse button on the Z-axis arrow. and then I'm going to come over to my location value. I'm going to right click the Z location, and I'm going to click Insert Single Keyframe. That value then goes yellow. We get a little yellow line here in the timeline, and these peculiar looking dots here in the dope sheet. These dots are called keyframes. Now, all that's doing is saying at this point, this sphere should be 12.98 blah 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 units up. Great. So now if we were to move 1 second into the animation, which would be by default would be 24, but I'm actually going to come over here. I'm going to change the frame rate to 25 because I prefer to work in multiples of 25. It's just easier maths. 25, 50, 75, you know, 24 is an odd one. So yeah, if we move the playhead in the dope sheet and in the timeline to 25, so that's 1 second into our animation, I can then again left click and drag the x-axis arrow to move the ball down to the floor. You can see the value is changed in the location, and it's only highlighted green. It's not yellow anymore. That's because we haven't set a keyframe for it. There's no keyframe here, but there are keyframes on this channel somewhere. That's why it's green. So we're going to right click it, insert single keyframe, and now we've got 2 keyframes. That's the beginning of an animation. Essentially, it says be here on frame 1, be here on frame 25, and I'll figure out all the frames in between. I will tween it or interpolate it, or extrapolate, I suppose, in a certain sense. So it's interpolating between the 2 values. It is creating all the frames in between. Very useful. So all we need to do now is make it bounce back up. Now, it's not going to bounce quite as high, and it's not going to bounce for quite as long. So we'll drag it back up a little bit, a few frames down, and we'll insert single keyframe. So what do we get now? Let's play this back to see what we've got. I'm going to hit Alt-A to hit playback. You can also play back here. Okay, great. And I'm just going to keep adding keyframes until I've got the extreme points of my animation. Another way we can add keyframes is actually by clicking this automatic keyframe recording and just move our object around the scene. The problem with this is it creates more keyframes than it needs. It creates all these rotation, scale, and X and Y location values. We don't really need all that, and I want to keep my animation nice and clean. I want to keep only the information that is pertinent to what I'm doing. Well, that value is clearly wrong. Should probably be there. And just making sure that it diminishes in just replacing the keyframes as I go. Let's do that one more time. Alt-A to play back. Now, I think you'll agree that looks, that's not great. What's happening is, whilst it's interpolating, it's coming out slowly. It's easing into this motion, but then it's easing back out again. It's almost like the ball is anticipating the floor and therefore slowing down, whereas a ball actually accelerates towards the floor and then sharply is rejected and bounces back. So what we're going to do is just split this panel one more time. We're going to go to our graph editor, and you can see the values of the interpolation, the tweening, all the in-between values to get from here to there are plotted out as a line. So value over time. So what we want to do is select all these bottom points where it contacts the floor, and I'm going to go SY just to scale them and make sure they're all at the same point. It's not important, but it's just neatness. I'm going to hit there's a the graph editor is really complicated, but all you need to know for this is we've got different handle types, and I'm going to hit V to access those handle types, and I'm going to change from I believe they're currently on automatic or aligned, which gives you this very smooth, easy curve. I'm going to change it to vector, which is this really sharp type of handles. So these handles are this thing's a handle, that's what I mean. So I'm just going to play that back, and you can see instantly that feels a lot more like a bounce. These are still going on a little bit too long though. So I think what I need to do is squish these down. So I'm going to just drag. You can drag these in the graph editor, but I find it easier to just move them along in the dope sheet. Words are failing me, I'm afraid. Probably sick of the sound of my voice by now. Anyway. So gravity acts as a constant, so it should always fall in a similar sort of way, and yeah, it's quite difficult to get it right. So you've just got to really play with it. I think this last one might be better as a vector as well, actually. Nope, definitely was better automatic. Again, I think we need 1 or 2 more keyframes. Just to sort of settle out that inertia. Again, the keyframes that you've used in the viewport also apply down in the other editor types. More often than not, if you select something, you can hit G to move it. You can hit R to rotate, which won't work on that, but it might work on here. Yeah, R to rotate, and S to scale something, or multiple points even. You can scale them apart from one another. So very, very useful to be able to do that for a variety of reasons. So anyway, so we've got a bouncing ball. I'm not going to keep finessing this. I could play with this all day and really just get the gravity just right and get it to feel just right as it bounces. But I've got better things to do with my time, and you're probably bored to tears. So, what else can we do to make this animation really sing? Well, it would be nice if it actually bounced along our scene. So we're going to add some motion on the x-axis. To do this, we're going to go to our first frame, and I'm just going to right-click and drag it along the x-axis, and as you can see, this value changes to -19 units. I'm going to insert a single keyframe there. And then I'm going to drag it all the way along to the end, actually a little bit past the end, and I'm going to move it, drag the UV sphere to a new position, and again insert single keyframe. I'm going to want to make sure that the value is constant in its motion at the start and then slowing down, so you can see this graceful curve. This is representing the ball slowing. This is it moving at a constant speed. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. It's a very slow bounce, isn't it? I mean, admittedly, the frames per second over here is means that we're not playing back in real time, so it's very difficult to see what our final animation will look like. That's probably because I'm screen recording at the same time as playing back. But there we go. So something else even so, I think that might be a slightly long animation. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to, with my mouse over either the dope sheet or the graph editor, hit A to select all, and I'm going to hit S to scale. Oops. S to scale, and then X, and you can see it'll scale along the X-axis, and we can actually shrink the length of time our animation takes. Much nicer. Unfortunately, that sort of scaled it into the middle of a scene. So why don't we do something about that? I'm going to hit Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, just to undo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. This is a pivot point, similar to our pivot point here. It's a pivot point for our graph editor. And I'm going to select 2D cursor. The 2D cursor is where these green crosshairs meet, the playhead and this sort of horizontal line. That's our 2D cursor in the graph editor. And what we can do is, now we've got that pivot point selected, if we hit S to scale and X to constrain it to the X-axis, so we're only scaling along the X-axis, as we drag, it will scale relative to the playhead, which is great. No, I'm going to keep doing that. Scale it a little bit better, a little bit further again, scale X. And just, yeah. That looks all right to me. I mean, again, it is playing a little bit slowly, so it's probably... yeah, it's probably about right. As I said, I'm not going to spend all day finessing this one. But this could certainly do with a little bit of a check. I want this to slow a little bit more. Now that slows way too much. So again, play with these values and, you know, see what you can get. This is a very long lesson. Coolio. So anyway, that's a bouncing ball. We could also, I mean, if we felt really fancy, we can always add some rotation on its y-axis. So I could just frame one, insert a single keyframe there, and then in line with our final X keyframe, we can just rotate that, loads, insert single keyframe. Those do not need to be adjusted. And now that should also rotate. Not that you can see it much. If there were a texture on our ball, we could probably, you know, see that a bit better. So that's a bouncing ball. Those are the basics of how to animate in Blender. I know there's a lot of information in there to take in, but just go in, play with it, and, you know, see how it feels to you. Figure out, you know, what does what in these different editors, and just sort of, yeah, try to enjoy it.